Often considered Europe's first failed flag carrier, Sabena, as the national airline of Belgium, lived a conflicted and controversial existence, with the company going from Belgium's connection to the world and a vital player on the African market to being a firm in seemingly endless fiscal trouble, wherein it only reported 2 non-consecutive years of profit throughout its entire history. These pressures intensified in the 1990s, particularly during its partnership with Swissair, a venture that ultimately failed to stabilize its fortunes, and by 2001, mounting financial problems became insurmountable, and Sabena collapsed, with the end of operations marking the fall of one of Europe's oldest national carriers. Sabena, short for Société Anonyme Belge d'Exploitation de la Navigation Aérienne, was officially established on May 23, 1923 by the Belgian government, with its creation following the closure of SNETA, or Syndicat National pour l'étude des Transports Aériens, an organization founded in 1919 to assess the commercial potential of aviation in the aftermath of World War I. SNETA had been instrumental in conducting test flights and laying the groundwork for a future national airline, but was never intended as a long-term operation, and when it was dissolved, Sabena took over its resources, infrastructure and staff, allowing for its seamless transition into full-scale, state-supported commercial aviation. The airline's founding was not just a domestic initiative, with Belgian investors in the Congo, then a vast colonial territory under Belgian rule, having experienced a setback when the local aviation service, LARA, or Ligne Aérienne Réunie Africaines, ceased operations in 1922, with these investors seeing Sabena as a logical replacement, with the expectation being that the new national carrier would restore and expand air services that supported colonial governance and trade. Thus, from the very beginning, Sabena was both a commercial venture and a political tool, aimed at strengthening Belgium's presence in Africa and asserting its position in the evolving European aviation landscape, though initially, Sabena's first operational focus was domestic, with its launch year seeing it provide links between Brussels and the major cities of Liège and Ostend, offering a faster, though more expensive alternative to the well-developed Belgian railway network. Aircraft such as the British-made Handley Page W8 biplane were deployed on these routes, and with a capacity for 10 to 15 passengers, an enclosed cabin, and relatively reliable performance, they represented a significant technological advance for the time, with these early flights also being crucial in establishing public trust in aviation, which was still viewed with considerable skepticism. Passengers were mainly business people, government officials, and the wealthy, while the airline also carried mail and light cargo, an essential revenue stream in an era when passenger numbers alone could not sustain operations. On April 1, 1924, Sabena launched its first revenue-earning international flight, running from Rotterdam to Strasbourg via Brussels, with this early example of a hub-and-spoke model reflecting Sabena's strategic intention to position Brussels as a central node in its growing network, while later in the year, the airline expanded international operations with routes to Amsterdam, Basel, London, Bremen and Copenhagen. By 1925, the airline's attention had turned towards the south, and through its recognition of the economic and strategic importance of the Belgian Congo, Sabena began laying the groundwork for a direct air link to Central Africa, with links to these colonies being entirely reliant on maritime routes, which was slow, vulnerable to weather delays, and inefficient for urgent cargo or official communications. The Congo's vast reserves of rubber, copper, diamonds and palm oil made it an economic lifeline for Belgium, and establishing a faster, more reliable connection was a top priority, with the construction of aerodromes across the colony beginning shortly thereafter, and were essentially basic hand-cleared landing strips in places like Boma, Leopoldville and Elizabethville, essential for any regular aviation service in such a vast and undeveloped territory. By 1926, this rudimentary but functional infrastructure was complete, and Sabena began internal colonial flights using de Havilland DH-50 aircraft, which was soon replaced by the larger and more capable 3-engine Handley Page W8F airliners, which could carry up to 10 passengers, and were more suited to the long-distance journeys over difficult terrains, with the Boma, Leopoldville, Elizabethville route, stretching 2,288 kilometers over jungle, becoming the backbone of domestic aviation in the Congo, and demonstrated the airline's technical capabilities in difficult environments. Meanwhile, Sabena was steadily expanding its European network, and by 1931 the airline had launched new services to Copenhagen and Malmö, extending its reach into Scandinavia, while the following year a route to Berlin was added, with Sabena's European services soon covering almost 6,000 kilometers of routes, and were supported by a growing and increasingly modern fleet. The 1930s also saw Sabena collaborating with major European civil aviation infrastructure was absorbed into the German war machine, while all commercial flights ceased entirely, and Sabena's aircraft were either confiscated, destroyed to prevent their use by the enemy, or pressed into military service by the occupying forces. The war also disrupted the lives of Sabena's personnel, with many pilots and engineers being conscripted into the Belgian military, while others fled to Allied countries, with some, like notable pilot Jean Decelles-Longchamp, escaping to Britain and joining the RAF, with Decelles-Longchamp becoming famous for his daring raid on the Gestapo headquarters in Brussels during 1943, flying a Hawker Typhoon in a personal act of defiance against the occupiers, earning him the Distinguished Flying Cross. When the war ended in 1945, Sabena faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding almost everything from scratch, with its fleet having been decimated, much of its skilled workforce dispersed or lost, and its main operating base heavily damaged, though by 1946, with the support of the Belgian government and through access to surplus military aircraft, Sabena returned to the skies, being launched as Sabena Belgian World Airlines. That same year, the airline began operating a fleet primarily composed of Douglas C-47 Dakotas, which were widely available at low cost and were key to restarting European services, re-establishing routes to major European cities including London, Paris and Amsterdam, while the reconstruction of Brussels Airport at Melsbroek was also well underway, supported by government and international investment, and by 1948 the airport had been modernized enough to serve as Sabena's principal hub once again. With its European routes stabilized, Sabena turned its focus to long-haul operations, with its reconnection with the Belgian Congo being a top priority for both political and economic reasons, with flights to Leopoldville resuming in 1946 using Douglas DC-4s, which were faster and more comfortable on runs to the Congo, with flights typically stopping in Dakar and Algiers for refueling. By 1947, Sabena expanded its ambitions further, and on June 4th the airline launched its first transatlantic flight to New York, initially using DC-4s, though these were later replaced by DC-6Bs, while in 1949, Sabena modernized its European fleet with the introduction of Convair 240s, replacing the older C-47s on regional services. The late 1940s also saw Sabena invest in long-haul expansion beyond Africa and the United States, with the airline acquiring Lockheed Constellations in 1949, which became the flagship for intercontinental routes, followed in 1957 by the introduction of the Douglas DC-7C, or 7Cs, to its fleet, which represented a significant step forward in performance and range, capable of flying non-stop from Brussels to New York under ideal conditions. The DC-7, however, would be quickly superseded by the arrival of the Boeing 707-320 in 1960, with Sabena becoming the first airline in mainland Europe to operate jet aircraft across the Atlantic, and although BOAC had already inaugurated jet services across the Atlantic with the de Havilland Comet 4, Sabena's adoption of the Boeing 707 signaled the beginning of the jet age for continental Europe, with the aircraft's performance, reliability and passenger comfort redefining expectations, making it a cornerstone of Sabena's long-haul strategy. In February 1961, Sabena expanded its jet operations within Europe, with the introduction of the Sud Aviation SE-210 Caravelle 6, which were deployed on short to medium-haul runs to replace the Convair 440s, though during that same year, Sabena faced a major operational crisis tied to geopolitical events in Africa, with the independence of the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 1960 having led to widespread unrest and violence targeting European interests. In response to escalating riots and the rapid deterioration of security, the Belgian government requisitioned Sabena's entire intercontinental fleet to evacuate thousands of Belgian nationals, with these emergency flights carried out under significant pressure and risk, demonstrating Sabena's logistical capability, but also exposed the fragility of its African network. The independence of the Congo effectively dismantled much of Sabena's regional route structure in Central Africa, with this being followed by the formation of Air Congo in June 1961, of which Sabena would hold a 30% stake, and thus formalized the end of Sabena's dominance in the region, while preserving a measure of its presence through joint operations and technical support. Throughout the 1960s, Sabena's modernization continued with the arrival of the Boeing 727-100 for domestic services within continental Europe, while in 1971, the airline introduced the Boeing 747-100 to its transatlantic services, with these new wide-body aircraft being deployed on flagship routes such as Brussels to New York, supplementing rather than replacing the Boeing 707-320Cs. While Sabena only acquired 2 of the first-generation 747s, their presence was crucial for maintaining the airline's competitive position on high-profile routes, while by 1973, the airline had phased out its 727s from its European network, in favour of the newer and more efficient Boeing 737-200s and would become the workhorses of Sabena's short and medium-haul operations. In 1974, Sabena bolstered its long-haul and cargo capabilities with the addition of the Douglas DC-1030, a wide-body trijet with intercontinental range, with the carrier acquiring 4 of these aircraft, which were used not only for passenger services, but also in convertible configuration that allowed for flexible cargo capacity, making the DC-10s a valuable asset as freight demand grew across the transatlantic and African markets. In the early 1980s, Sabena found itself increasingly squeezed by the changing dynamics of the global aviation industry, as with deregulation reshaping competition, fuel prices fluctuating unpredictably, and new market entrants challenging legacy carriers, Sabena's reliance on aging aircraft was becoming a liability. To address these pressures, Sabena initiated a major overhaul of its operations, centered on modernizing its fleet, with the airline recognizing that competing with major carriers such as Lufthansa, Air France and British Airways required not only new aircraft, but also a fundamental shift in how it planned its services and route. The turning point came in 1984 with the arrival of the Airbus A310, marking Sabena's first order from Airbus and signaling a shift in its strategic alignment within the European aerospace sector. While building on this progress, Sabena launched direct services to Tokyo from 1985, opening up its first dedicated route into East Asia. As the 1980s progressed, Sabena extended its reach to other key Asian destinations, including Bangkok, Hong Kong and Singapore, while inaugurating similar new services to Middle Eastern cities such as Beirut, Tel Aviv and Dubai. On its European network, Sabena pressed ahead with short and medium-haul renewal, while in the 1990s, Sabena increased its commitment to Airbus by adding both the A330 and A340 to its long-haul fleet, making it possible to introduce new ultra-long-haul routes to cities such as Johannesburg, Tokyo and Bangkok without refueling stops. However, these strategic moves came with heavy financial and operational demands, with entry into these new markets being expensive and testing the carrier's ability to maintain this complexity, with Sabena's dependence on the Belgian government for financial support becoming more pronounced as its debts mounted. And while successive governments were reluctant to let the national carrier collapse, the airline's structure and limited profitability placed it in a vulnerable position within a global industry that rewarded scale, agility, and access to private capital. Sabena had long been a financially struggling carrier, with the company operating with an inflexible bureaucracy, an inefficient management structure, and a heavily unionized workforce that resisted reform, with much of the trouble stemming during the 1970s, as while European rivals such as Lufthansa and British Airways began to respond to the prospects of deregulation and competition by tightening operations and cutting costs, Sabena remained anchored to a bloated structure, with labour costs being disproportionately high. Union influence was entrenched, and the airline was plagued by frequent strikes, while any attempt to curtail labour expenses or streamline operations was met with political obstruction, as successive Belgian governments, sensitive to the social impact of layoffs, refused to back aggressive reform, and as a result, Sabena continued operating with a level of rigidity that made meaningful change almost impossible. By the 1980s, the airline situation had become more urgent, with Carlos van Petgem, appointed as CEO during this period, bringing with him a sweeping vision of global growth, his leadership pushing Sabena into a new era of modernization, with the introduction of Airbus A310 aircraft, expanded long-haul services, and forays into new markets including Asia and North America, but all of this came at a severe price. Throughout the decade, government bailouts became a regular fixture, with the airline receiving repeated infusions of public money, often in the form of loans, direct subsidies, or debt forgiveness, but none of these interventions addressed the core inefficiencies within Sabena's structure, with 1991 seeing the government enact one of the most sweeping rescue packages yet, providing a 10 billion franc capital injection and cancelling 16 billion francs of outstanding debt. However, the European Commission imposed a strict condition that no further bailouts would be permitted unless Sabena secured external investment, and thus, amid a frantic search for a strategic partner, April 1992 would see an agreement reached with Air France, which saw the French airline, through its investment arm Finacta, inject capital into Sabena and gain significant sway over the airline's direction. In theory, the partnership offered Sabena access to new management expertise, economies of scale, and a more coherent route strategy, but in practice, the benefits failed to materialize, with internal issues at Air France, including its own financial troubles and leadership reshuffles, destabilizing the alliance, and by 1993 cooperation between the two airlines had begun to break down. Strategic decisions stalled, tensions mounted, and by the end of 1994, Air France had formally withdrawn, leaving Sabena once again financially exposed and strategically adrift, with that year seeing Sabena post a loss of $125.6 million on revenues of $1.2 billion, with weak performance in African markets contributing to the shortfall. The executive instability that plagued Sabena during this period further compounded its troubles, with changes in top leadership being frequent and often politically motivated, with the carrier, as a symbol of Belgian national identity, seeing CEOs influenced as much by linguistic balance and party alignment as by professional qualifications, with coalition politics in Belgium, divided between Flemish and Walloon factions, regularly spilling over into Sabena's boardroom. Leadership turnover became routine, with each incoming CEO reversing or reshaping the strategic initiatives of their predecessor, while long-term planning became virtually impossible, and strategic consistency, crucial for an airline operating in a highly competitive and capital-intensive industry, was entirely absent. This political interference filtered through every level of decision-making, with attempts to close unprofitable routes, restructure departments, or reduce staffing levels being regularly blocked or diluted, while the government, which demanded improvements in efficiency, remained unwilling to back the kind of sweeping reforms necessary to achieve them. By 1990, the structural contradictions were more exposed than ever, with Sabena losing its legal monopoly on scheduled domestic routes, a protection it had enjoyed since 1949, with the opening up of Belgian skies to other carriers being part of a broader European liberalisation effort, and added further pressure to an airline already struggling to compete, while external shocks, including the Gulf War and a worldwide economic slowdown, sent fuel prices soaring and passenger numbers falling. In response, the government appointed Pierre Godefroy, an executive from the private sector, as chairman in late 1990, with Godefroy introducing a radical restructuring plan that included cutting 2,500 jobs, reorganizing internal departments, and preparing the airline for eventual privatization, with his approach reflecting private sector discipline, with an emphasis on efficiency and accountability. However, his reforms sparked renewed conflict with labour unions, triggering fresh strikes and halting progress on several fronts, this resistance being fierce, particularly among workers who feared layoffs and resented the erosion of long-held protections. By the close of 1990, Sabena's capital base had all but vanished, and another round of rescue packages followed, including 10 billion francs in cash, 16 billion in debt cancellations, and a further pledge of 9 billion more if Godefroy could secure external investment. And though the 1992 deal with Air France nominally met that requirement, it did little to stabilise Sabena in the longer term, while the airline was also legally restructured, shedding its exceptional status and becoming a conventional société anonyme. In 1995, though, Sabena's fate would become intertwined with Swiss national carrier Swissair, following the formalisation of a strategic partnership that fundamentally altered the Belgian flag carrier's trajectory, with this deal, signed in May 1995 after lengthy negotiations, seeing Swissair acquire a 49.5% stake in Sabena for 10 billion francs. The Belgian government retained a narrow majority share of 50.5%, allowing the airline to maintain its status as a European community carrier in line with EU ownership regulations, with this agreement being more than a capital injection, as it bound Sabena to Swissair's aggressive and increasingly risky hunter strategy, a broader plan to establish a pan-European airline network through acquisitions and partnerships. The operational impact of the partnership was immediate, with Swissair beginning to embed itself into Sabena's structures, taking the lead on strategic planning, cost control and long-term operational reforms, with 1996 seeing Sabena sign multiple cooperation agreements with Swissair, including deals covering fleet planning and cargo transport. Sabena's aging and inefficient fleet was to be replaced in stages with Airbus models already favoured by the Swiss, with orders being placed for 23 Avro RJ85s in 1995, which were chosen over Fokker aircraft despite internal dissent, and in 1997, a large order followed for 34 Airbus A319s, A320s and A321s, alongside 7 long-haul aircraft. The aim was to harmonise Sabena's fleet with Swissair's, cut maintenance and training costs, and improve the passenger experience, while wide-body jets such as the Boeing 747-300s, DC-10s and A310s would be retired or sold off, this transformation seeing Sabena's fleet, by the end of the decade, become one of the youngest in Europe, with an average age of just 4 years. Swissair also took direct control of management, with Pierre Godefroy resigning in March 1996, following fierce labour unrest triggered by his attempts to impose sweeping austerity, including a salary freeze and an increase in working hours, with the appointment of Swissair executive Paul Reutlinger as CEO, marking a new phase in Sabena's overhaul. Reutlinger's mandate was clear, to deliver 4.7 billion francs in savings by 1998, with his Horizon 98 plan relying on a mix of salary reductions, job cuts, altered working conditions and structural reforms, thus leading to a fierce standoff with the unions, which culminated in an October 1996 compromise that saw modest wage cuts, the loss of 730 jobs through voluntary redundancy and early retirement, and increased flexibility in work patterns. Reutlinger simultaneously restructured the company's organization, with 1999 seeing Sabena divided into three main business units: airline operations, Brussels hub services, and technical support, with this restructuring being designed to improve accountability, clarify financial performance, and potentially prepare individual units for future sale or external investment, while also mirroring Swissair's strategy of creating modular airline holdings within the Swissair group, facilitating internal benchmarking and external transparency. As part of the integration, Sabena joined the Qualifier Group frequent flyer program in 1999 and co-founded SA Atraxis Belgium, a joint IT venture with Swissair's technology arm, while Swissair took over the commercial management of Sabena's cargo capacity, and a series of agreements were signed covering catering, maintenance and scheduling coordination. In principle, this would create synergies and reduce duplication, but in practice, integration faced significant friction, with the two airlines using incompatible IT systems, while corporate cultures clashed, with efforts to standardize processes being slow and often frustrated by bureaucracy and national sensitivities. Another major reform area was Sabena's route network, with 1996 seeing unprofitable short-haul European routes be gradually outsourced to lower-cost operators, with a high-profile example being the Brussels to London Heathrow service, which was handed over to Virgin Express under a wet lease arrangement, with this partnership being later extended to cover services to Rome, Barcelona and London Gatwick. Sabena retained control over business-class ticketing, but economy seats were marketed by Virgin Express, with the airline justifying these decisions as necessary cost-saving measures, claiming they improved load factors and financial performance, though analysts warned that Sabena was cannibalizing its own network, weakening brand recognition and sacrificing premium revenue. Despite these complications, Reutlinger's reforms delivered short-term improvements, and in 1997, Sabena posted an operating profit of 615 million francs, although it still reported a net loss of 2.5 billion francs due to one-off restructuring charges, while during the first half of 1998, the airline returned to profit, earning 59 million Belgian francs, with passenger numbers topping 8 million, aided by the introduction of a five-wave hub model at Brussels Airport that allowed for more efficient transfers and improved connectivity. Integration into the Atlantic Excellence Alliance with Swissair, Delta Airlines and Austrian Airlines provided access to lucrative North Atlantic routes and supported Sabena's efforts to capture premium passengers through coordinated schedules and shared revenue pools, though these gains would prove to be brittle, as Sabena's European network remained under intense pressure from rapidly growing low-cost carriers like Ryanair and EasyJet. On long-haul routes, its footprint was limited outside Africa, where it remained one of Europe's leading carriers, with North American services, run in partnership with Delta, often being unprofitable due to fierce price competition and high operational costs, and while code sharing and pooling helped mitigate losses, Sabena lacked the scale and reach of its larger European competitors and remained vulnerable to external shocks. By 1999, the Brussels hub was operating at full pace, with 5 daily waves designed to maximize transfer opportunities, while Sabena's market share at the airport hovered around 42%, making it the dominant carrier, though questions lingered about whether this model was sustainable, as with Swissair continuing to hold 49.5% of Sabena, discussions persisted around increasing this to a 67% controlling stake, though this was contingent on Switzerland aligning its aviation policies with the European Union, something that remained politically and legally uncertain. At the start of 1999, Sabena and Swissair jointly developed the Airline Management Partnership, or AMP, an initiative aimed at fusing their key commercial and strategic operations, with the concept being to pool network planning, marketing, sales and financial oversight into a centralized structure in order to unlock synergies and impose a streamlined governance model across both airlines. By February of that year, senior executives had agreed on the project's core architecture, with the Belgian government, still holding a majority stake in Sabena, giving conditional approval in June 1999, with explicit demands for employee guarantees, the safeguarding of Belgian operational autonomy, and the retention of Brussels as a major European hub. Despite this provisional political support, tensions soon emerged, with October 1999 seeing Belgian State Minister Rick Dames intervene to halt the AMP's full rollout, citing concerns over sovereignty and the preservation of national interests, and after direct negotiations with Swissair Group CEO Philippe Rougissier, an uneasy compromise was reached, with November seeing the Sabena board approve the AMP in principle. A month later, Swissair Group made clear its ambition to acquire full ownership of Sabena, intending to increase its stake from 49.5% to 100%, to which the Belgian state agreed in April 2000 to a term sheet which would transfer an 85% majority share to Swissair Group, while giving Belgium a minority holding in the Swiss parent company and 2 seats on Sabena's board. This agreement formally creating the AMP as a British registered company with retroactive effect to the beginning of 2000. While this restructuring continued on paper, the business itself was deteriorating, and by mid-2000, Sabena's financial position had worsened dramatically, with Paul Reutlinger being replaced as CEO by Christoph Müller, a German national who had previously served as Chief Operating Officer, with Reutlinger insisting he was leaving a sound operation behind, though in reality, Müller found an airline deep in debt and losing ground in a highly competitive European market. In response, he introduced the Blue Sky Plan, a comprehensive recovery plan designed to deliver €410 million in savings through downsizing, fleet rationalization and restructuring, this including the sale of profitable subsidiaries such as Sabena Technics, drastic headcount reductions, a focus on higher seat occupancy with smaller aircraft, and renewed attempts to renegotiate delivery schedules for a large Airbus order. The context for these reforms was made all the more unstable by a parallel financial implosion within Swissair, with the Hunter strategy having begun to unravel after various bold and reckless investments in loss-making firms, which thus exposed the Swissair Group to heavy losses themselves from partners such as French Airlines, AOM, Air Liberté and Air Littoral, as well as the German carrier LTU. Sabena too had recorded significant losses for the year 2000, estimated at around 13 billion Belgian francs, with the financial collapse of the Swiss parent making continued investment in Sabena politically and economically unattractive. In January 2001, despite signing another set of agreements with the Belgian government to recapitalize Sabena with an additional €250 million, cracks in the relationship widened, and Brigissier was forced to resign in favor of Eric Honecker, then briefly by Maurice Suter, before finally becoming stabilized with Mario Corti, though each leadership change at Swissair brought new ambiguity regarding the group's intentions. By February, Honecker openly cast doubt on Swissair Group's ability to maintain its commitments, and though the capital injection was formally approved by shareholders on February 23rd, it became increasingly clear that Swissair was manoeuvring to extract itself from the alliance. Sabena, meanwhile, was running out of time, and on February 8th, following a legal obligation under Belgian corporate law due to the collapse in net assets, an extraordinary general meeting was held, and although no full agreement had been reached with the unions, management was able to present sufficient progress to convince shareholders to approve the emergency funding contingent upon further labour savings. The Blue Sky Plan demanded major productivity increases, particularly from pilots, whose resistance had already triggered a wildcat strike on February 7th, and while ground and cabin staff unions were more conciliatory, relations between management and labour remained brittle. Through the spring of 2001, Swissair's retreat accelerated, with April and May seeing Corti formally communicate that Swissair Group intended to reverse course on its promise to take a majority stake in Sabena, citing the group's unsustainable losses and the opposition of its bankers to any further cash injections, with the Belgian government threatening legal action and, in July, initiated proceedings against Swissair for breach of contract and damages related to allegedly coercive aircraft orders made under the 1997 fleet harmonization deal, followed by Sabena joining the suit shortly thereafter. On the night of July 17, 2001, after private negotiations at the Astoria Hotel in Brussels, a final compromise was struck, in which the Swissair Group would be released from its obligation to become Sabena's majority shareholder, but in exchange would provide a last tranche of €258 million, while the Belgian state would contribute €172 million. Swissair also agreed to assume delivery of 9 Airbus A319s originally intended for Sabena, with the lawsuits being dropped, and the partners pledging to continue commercial operation, though this agreement, while politically expedient, did not address the root causes of Sabena's malaise, with the Blue Sky Plan having been further revised to include the sale of strategic assets, the reduction of long-haul operations, and sharp cuts to the workforce. Unions voiced strong opposition, warning that the company was being hollowed out and left exposed to market shocks, without the buffer of its profitable subsidiaries, and while Sabena was now a leaner carrier in theory, in practice it remained structurally fragile and heavily reliant on state aid and dwindling passenger trust. By September 2001, Sabena's losses for the first half of the year had exploded to €83.6 million, a six-fold increase on the previous year, despite an 11% rise in passenger traffic, with the airline bleeding cash at a rate of €400,000 per day and carrying a debt burden of over €2 billion, most of it linked to the costly fleet renewal plan approved in the late 1990s. This strategy, which doubled the number of Airbus aircraft on order to 34 without full financing in place, proved disastrous, and while the new aircraft improved operational efficiency, the debt servicing costs outpaced any gains. However, any attempt to save Sabena was quashed on September 11, 2001, when terrorists aligned with the Islamic fundamentalist group Al-Qaeda used commercial airliners as weapons in a series of coordinated attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., killing nearly 3,000 people. Sabena, deeply reliant on transatlantic routes to New York, Chicago and Boston, saw its revenue plunge as U.S. airspace remained closed for several days, while longer-term demand even after services resumed plummeted, with late September 2001 seeing passenger numbers drop to 530,000 against a figure of 790,000 the previous September, while load factors on key long-haul routes, especially to the United States, fell below 50%. The airline's fate was sealed by the collapse of its strategic partner, with September 25th and 26th, seeing the Belgian government be quietly informed via legal counsel that Swissair would not be able to provide the €85 million capital injection promised under the July 2001 Astoria Agreement, with this being formally confirmed on October 1st by Swissair CEO Mario Corti, who also announced that Swissair had filed for legal composition, the Swiss equivalent of bankruptcy protection. Swissair's grounding of all flights on the same day shocked the European aviation sector and marked the beginning of its own disintegration, and in a final bid to keep the airline alive, Sabena reached a partial agreement with its unions on September 27th after 2 days of intense negotiations, with the original survival plan, which called for 1,400 job losses, asset sales and the reduction of unprofitable routes, being slightly softened. The number of forced redundancies was reduced to fewer than 500 through expanded early retirement options, and the unions agreed to put the revised plan to an employee referendum, which was scheduled ahead of the October 3rd shareholder meeting, which was to approve a €430 million capital injection, but with Swissair now bankrupt and unable to contribute its portion, the financing plan unravelled almost immediately. On that same day, Sabena filed for legal composition with the Brussels Commercial Court, requesting creditor protection while it attempted to stabilise, with the court granting the request 2 days later, setting a protection period until November 30th, with this temporary shield allowing Muller's team to attempt a salvage of what assets they could, but the effort was hindered by further lawsuits from creditors, ongoing union resistance, and rapidly deteriorating market conditions. On November 3, 2001, the Belgian state and Sabena reactivated legal proceedings against Swissair Group, the parent company of Swissair, by filing additional claims, though this legal manoeuvre, while aggressive in form, had little practical consequence, with debts exceeding €2 billion and creditors circling to recover what they could, while aircraft leases were already in the process of reclaiming planes, many of which had been grounded due to unpaid lease agreements. Fuel providers, maintenance companies and other critical service suppliers had either suspended contracts or begun legal action to secure overdue payments, and as Sabena's liquidity evaporated, it became clear that operations could not be sustained much longer. The government, once Sabena's majority shareholder, had seen the case pass to the judiciary under creditor protection, with what had been intended as a transition towards restructuring being overtaken by events, while tensions escalated between political leaders and the courts, in particular between Luc Cohen, Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Guy Verhofstadt, and Anne Spiritus Desses, President of the Brussels Commercial Court. Spiritus Desses would later allege that she felt personally threatened by a senior government figure in relation to her decisions concerning the Sabena Inter-Service Centre or SIC, a subsidiary embroiled in the wider insolvency, but amid this legal wrangling, by November 5, 2001, it was evident to all parties that the end was imminent. Sabena announced internally that it would suspend all operations within 48 hours, but leaks to the press made this news public almost immediately, prompting alarm across the country, while the following day, the despair of the airline's 10,000 employees spilled over into visible disorganised protest, with staff at Brussels airport walking off the job, check-in desks being deserted, baggage left unattended, and hundreds of passengers being caught in limbo, unsure of whether their flights would depart. The airport descended into confusion, and flights were cancelled en masse, with the Sabena name vanishing from departure boards, and by 6:30 that evening, Judge Spiritus Desses formally declared the airline bankrupt, this ruling being published in Belgium's official state gazette the next day, making the decision legally binding and irreversible. That same day, Sabena's final scheduled service, Flight 690 from Cotonou and Abidjan, landed at Brussels' Zaventem Airport, as operated by Airbus A340-311 Oscar Oscar Sierra Charlie Zulu, carrying 266 passengers and 11 crew, with the airliner being greeted by staff and crew on the ramp at Brussels, rounding out 78 years of Belgium's flag carrier. The collapse of Sabena was not just a corporate failure, but a national trauma, marking the first bankruptcy of a European flag carrier and sending shockwaves across the continent, with direct job losses being immediate and severe, affecting approximately 10,000 employees, with a further 30,000 jobs impacted indirectly through related industries, while also triggering a broader economic fallout in and around Brussels, especially at Zaventem Airport, which had relied heavily on Sabena's operations. Government officials scrambled to contain the damage, and within days a plan was unveiled to create a new airline based on Delta Air Transport or DAT, a smaller Sabena subsidiary that had operated many of its regional flights, with the government securing €125 billion in support from regional authorities and private investors to relaunch the operation under a new brand. This effort aimed to preserve as many jobs as possible, with estimates suggesting that up to 6,000 positions could be retained, while talks continued with Virgin Express about a potential merger, but the discussions remained inconclusive and lacked the urgency the moment demanded. In the months that followed, a parliamentary commission of inquiry was launched to assess how such a historic institution had been allowed to fail, with the inquiry exposing a tangled history of mismanagement, political interference and poor strategic decision-making, while also revealing the extent to which the Belgian state had lost oversight during critical phases of the airline's deterioration, particularly under the weight of its increasingly dysfunctional partnership with Swissair. The conduct of various ministers came under scrutiny, with Rick Dames, the Public Enterprises Minister at the time, having retained a private law firm to assist with his defence before the inquiry, an action which cost over €150,000 in public money and raised serious questions about the use of state resources. The human cost of Sabena's collapse became painfully clear by early 2002, with thousands of employees, many with decades of service, struggling to find new work, with the town of Wallonia in Charleroi seeing around 45% of former staff registered with 4M, the regional employment agency, still being unemployed a year after Sabena's collapse. Female employees, especially cabin crew, were disproportionately affected, with retraining programs being slow to launch and poorly coordinated, while a proposed social plan to provide compensation and early retirement packages stalled repeatedly due to legal and administrative hurdles, with pensioners and those nearing retirement being excluded from key benefits. Many workers received no severance pay for months, and sometimes up to and over a year, while the receivership process, tasked with processing outstanding payments, moved slowly, and by the end of January 2003, just over 2,100 former employees had received payments out of a backlog of more than 7,000 claims. In economic terms, Sabena's bankruptcy was a blow to national output, with economists in the Bureau de Plan estimating that the collapse would cut between 0.3 and 0.5% of Belgium's GDP in 2002, and while the global economy was already in recession as a result of the September 11th attacks, Sabena's downfall was fundamentally a product of deeper, longer-term structural weaknesses, with the airline having only posted profits twice in its history, once in 1995 and again in 1998. As for DAT, in early 2002, a rescue consortium led by SN Air Holding took over the carrier and launched a rapid rebranding initiative, transforming it into SN Brussels Airlines, with the decision to retain the SN prefix from Sabena's IATA code, signalling continuity, but the airline's structure and philosophy had shifted fundamentally. SN Brussels Airlines inherited a modest fleet and a solid base of European routes, prioritizing a return to fundamentals, focusing on reliability, operational efficiency, and high-quality service for business travelers, positioning itself as a premium alternative to the growing low-cost sector, but refraining from replicating Sabena's expansive and financially hazardous global reach. As the European base stabilized, the airline returned to Africa, resuming these services cautiously, starting in 2003 with Kinshasa, Dakar and Nairobi, while the airline acquired Airbus A330 aircraft for long-haul services, deploying them selectively on high-demand routes, thus generating healthy yields and re-establishing Belgium's role as a bridge between Europe and Africa. By 2005, the airline had achieved a level of commercial stability, but faced growing pressure from low-cost carriers which had transformed the European market, with Ryanair and EasyJet rapidly capturing the market share with ultra-low fares and aggressive expansion, to which SN Brussels Airlines, with its full-service model, could not compete directly on price. To address this challenge and scale up operations, SN Air Holding acquired Virgin Express in April 2005, with the merger between SN Brussels Airlines and Virgin Express being announced in March 2006, Though the actual transition process was complex due to the differing nature of both carriers' practices, with SN Brussels Airlines catering to business-class passengers and flew to Africa and major European cities, while Virgin Express served leisure markets with simplified service and point-to-point operations. Initially, the two brands operated separately while back-office systems, fleets and staffing were merged, until finally, in March 2007, the unified airline launched under the new name of Brussels Airlines, which blended SN Brussels Airlines' long-haul expertise with Virgin Express's short-haul pragmatism, retaining a two-tier product strategy of premium service on African and business-heavy European routes and cost-effective travel on high-volume leisure-focused services. Despite operational progress, Brussels Airlines still face structural challenges, with the European market remaining crowded, fuel prices fluctuating, and long-haul ambitions carrying inherent risks, to which, in September 2008, Lufthansa entered the picture by acquiring a 45% stake in SN Air Holding, giving it strategic influence and a pathway to eventual control. The deal included an option to buy the remaining shares and was designed to integrate Brussels Airlines into Lufthansa's broader European network, while in 2009, Brussels Airlines formally joined the Star Alliance group, aligning its frequent flyer program with Lufthansa's Miles & More, with membership in Star Alliance giving Brussels Airlines greater visibility, smoother connections, and the ability to code-share with global carriers. By 2016, Lufthansa exercised its option to acquire full ownership, with the deal being completed in early 2017, making Brussels Airlines a fully integrated subsidiary of the Lufthansa Group, and while the airline retains its brand and autonomy in some areas, it now benefits from group-wide procurement, maintenance and operational support, with Lufthansa valuing Brussels Airlines for its African expertise, which complemented its own network and offered strategic advantages in high-growth markets. Ultimately, the rise and spectacular fall of Sabena represents a case in point of a flag airline that had relied far too heavily for far too long on its respective government, helping to shore up its own inefficiencies, while also allowing bad habits to run rampant, such as the carrier's misguided attempts at expanding into long-haul markets it had no strength to compete in effectively. In reality, the airline was simply too small, too niche, and too complex in its legacy operations to effectively compete with other national airlines and emerging low-cost carriers, and though Swissair's intentions were to try and iron out many of its managerial and corporate flaws, these were too ingrained in its very fabric, while political interference from the Belgian government hamstrung any attempts for cohesive forward planning. It was this combination of bad decisions and long-standing inefficiencies that made Sabena ripe for destruction when the September 11th attacks occurred, and while it was able to outlast its strategic partner of Swissair by a month, the carrier could not escape the consequences of decades of poor management and decisions, leading to its abrupt and traumatic collapse in November 2001.